They said the law owned her body. They said God approved it. And everyone on the plantation agreed, except the man who could not stop thinking about her when the lights went out. In the American South, in the year 1841, sin did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like silence. Magnolia Ridge Plantation rose from the land like a monument to order. White columns, wide porches, manicured paths leading to fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. Cotton bloomed like snow under a merciless sun, and beneath it moved hundreds of enslaved bodies, bending, lifting, bleeding, surviving. To the outside world, Magnolia Ridge was success. To those who lived inside it, it was a cage with no visible bars. Eliza learned this before she learned how to read the sky for rain. She was 19 years old and had never known freedom. Not even as an idea that belonged to her. Freedom was something whispered about in stories passed from mouth to mouth after dark, always spoken softly, always cut short when footsteps approached. She had been born on Magnolia Ridge, delivered on a dirt floor by women who knew pain better than doctors ever could. Her mother had died when Eliza was 12, worked into exhaustion, and then worked beyond it. No marker bore her name. No record remembered her breath. Eliza remembered everything. She remembered the smell of her mother's skin after long days in the fields. She remembered the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders too early. And she remembered the first time she understood what it meant to be owned. That understanding came the day she was moved from the fields to the big house. Nathaniel Harrow inherited Magnolia Ridge at 32. He had not wanted it. That was the first lie he told himself. The truth was more complicated. Nathaniel had grown up surrounded by the machinery of slavery without ever examining it closely. Like most men born into wealth in the South, he had been taught that the system was natural, necessary, even benevolent when managed properly. His father had been cruel, brutal in ways Nathaniel swore he would never be. I will be different, he told himself the day his father was buried. Different felt righteous. Different felt safe. But different, as Nathaniel would learn, did not mean innocent. When the estate became his, Magnolia Ridge came with land, livestock, and 300 enslaved souls listed neatly on paper. Names reduced to numbers, lives reduced to value. Nathaniel told himself he would run the plantation efficiently, not violently. He dismissed one overseer, replaced him with another whose cruelty was quieter, but no less real. He told himself that restraint made him a good man. The law agreed with him. The church agreed with him. Society applauded him. And then Eliza entered the house. She was brought inside to work as a seamstress and house servant, chosen not for skill alone, but for appearance. Light brown skin, sharp eyes, a posture that spoke of quiet strength rather than submission. Nathaniel noticed her immediately, not as desire, not yet, as presence. She moved differently from the others, careful, controlled, alert. Her silence was not emptiness, it was observation. The first time their eyes met, Eliza looked away quickly. She had learned that lesson young. Nathaniel felt something uncomfortable tighten in his chest. Authority, he told himself. Nothing more. Days passed. Weeks. Eliza learned the rhythms of the house quickly, when to speak, when not to, when to disappear into corners so thoroughly that even her breath felt borrowed. Nathaniel watched without meaning to. He noticed how she flinched when voices rose, how she straightened when spoken to directly, how she never wasted movement, as if conserving energy for survival itself. At night, Nathaniel drank alone in his study, the weight of ownership pressing down on him in ways he could not articulate. He told himself he was tired. He told himself he was lonely. He did not tell himself the truth. The truth was that power distorts desire, and Magnolia Ridge was built entirely on power. Eliza knew the danger long before Nathaniel did. She saw the way his gaze lingered too long. She felt the air shift when he entered a room she occupied. She recognized the signs not from romance, but from warning. Her mother had taught her well. The master's attention is not a gift, her mother had said once. It is a threat that smiles. Eliza did everything she could to remain invisible. It did not work. The first line was crossed quietly. Nathaniel asked her to stay late one evening, to mend a coat. His voice was calm, polite, almost gentle. Eliza's hands trembled as she worked. The room felt smaller. He stood too close, said her name too softly. Nothing happened. And that was the most dangerous part, because nothing happening meant it could happen again. Word travels differently on plantations. It does not move openly. It seeps. Other servants noticed the looks, the requests, the silence after. Eliza felt eyes on her back, heard whispers stop when she entered rooms. She prayed without words. Nathaniel justified everything. He told himself he admired her intelligence, her composure, her humanity. He did not call it desire, he did not call it sin, but the law already made him powerful. And power does not ask permission. One night, thunder rolled across Magnolia Ridge, shaking windows and nerves alike. Eliza was summoned to Nathaniel's study again. This time the air was different. He spoke of loneliness, of pressure, of responsibility. She listened, he moved closer, she froze. The moment stretched thin as a blade. In that moment, history held its breath. Because what followed would not be a love story. It would be a record of imbalance, guilt, survival, and longing twisted into something no one would ever be proud of. Eliza was owned by law. Nathaniel was desired by sin, and neither would escape unchanged. Power rarely announces itself when it grows. It does not arrive shouting or striking at first. It settles quietly into routines, into expectations, into the spaces where resistance once lived and slowly learned to remain still. At Magnolia Ridge, power had always existed. What changed was how closely it began to breathe. After the night of the storm, after Nathaniel Harrow had stood too near and spoken too softly, something invisible but undeniable shifted between him and Eliza. No words were exchanged about it. No rules were written. Yet both understood that a line had been crossed, not by action, but by intent. And intent, in a place like Magnolia Ridge, was never harmless. Eliza returned to her duties the next morning with the same posture she had always worn, head lowered, movements precise, voice quiet. To anyone watching from a distance, nothing appeared different, but inside her chest, vigilance tightened like a drawn cord. She had learned early that survival was not about escape. It was about anticipation. She noticed the changes immediately. Nathaniel's requests for her presence became more frequent, though never openly improper, always reasonable, always defensible. A coat to mend, papers to carry, a room to clean that no one else had been assigned to. Each request alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Eliza understood patterns. Patterns were how punishment arrived. Nathaniel told himself he was being careful. That was the word he chose. Careful implied control. It implied restraint. It implied morality. He convinced himself that as long as he did not touch her, as long as no explicit command was spoken, he remained within the boundaries of decency. He told himself he was nothing like his father, who had taken what he wanted openly and without shame. Nathaniel believed silence made him better. But silence did not erase the imbalance that saturated every moment they shared. When Eliza entered a room, she did so knowing she could not refuse his summons. When Nathaniel spoke, he did so knowing his voice carried authority, no matter how softly he used it. That knowledge pressed on him in ways that both thrilled and repulsed him. At night, alone in his bed, he lay awake replaying small moments. The way Eliza's hands moved with careful efficiency, the way her breathing changed when he stood too close, the way her eyes never quite met his anymore. He told himself it was loneliness. He told himself it was stress. He did not tell himself the truth, that power had awakened something inside him he had never been forced to confront before. The other enslaved servants noticed long before either of them acknowledged it. Women whispered in the washhouse. Men exchanged glances that carried warning rather than curiosity. Everyone on Magnolia Ridge understood what attention from the master could mean, even when it arrived wrapped in politeness. Eliza felt the shift in how others looked at her. Not with jealousy, with fear. Fear was contagious on plantations. It spread quietly, infecting every interaction. Fear of being singled out. Fear of being blamed. fear of being associated too closely with someone marked by danger. Eliza became isolated, without anyone ever saying so. That isolation hurt more than she expected. One afternoon, Nathaniel called Eliza into his study under the pretense of organizing correspondence. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the air. The room smelled of ink, leather, and something sharper: control. He stood behind his desk as she worked, his presence heavy but unmoving. "You learn quickly," he said at last. "Yes, sir," she replied. The word sir felt heavier every day. He walked closer, stopping just behind her shoulder. "You could do more than this," he said. "You have intelligence." Eliza's hands stilled. Intelligence was not a compliment in this context, it was a justification. She kept her eyes down. "I do what I'm told," she said. Nathaniel heard something in her voice then. Not defiance, not submission, but exhaustion. It unsettled him. For a moment he wanted to apologize. Instead, he dismissed her. The silence after she left the room was louder than any argument. The escalation was not dramatic. That was its danger. No single moment could be pointed to and condemned. No act could be named without also naming the system that made it possible. Everything existed in the grey space where accountability dissolved. Nathaniel began to find reasons to be near Eliza during meals, during household tasks, during moments meant for rest. He spoke to her more directly than to others, asked her questions, not about her past, never that, but about her work, her thoughts, her observations. Each question carried risk, each answer cost her something. Eliza responded carefully, giving enough to satisfy him but never enough to invite intimacy. She understood that curiosity from a man like Nathaniel was not neutral. It was hunger disguised as interest. She began to dream of her mother. In those dreams, her mother never spoke, only watched, her eyes filled with warning. Nathaniel's internal conflict grew harder to ignore. He attended church on Sundays, listening to sermons about order, obedience, and divine hierarchy. The words comforted him. They assured him that the world was as it should be, that power rested in the correct hands. But when he returned home, those assurances felt thin. Eliza's presence disrupted the narratives he had accepted without question. Her intelligence, her restraint, her humanity, each contradicted the lies that made slavery feel tolerable. Rather than confront the system, Nathaniel internalized the conflict. He told himself Eliza was different. That thought frightened him more than anything else, because difference invited exception, and exception invited justification. One evening, as summer thickened the air and tempers on the plantation grew short, an argument erupted between an overseer and an enslaved man in the fields. Nathaniel intervened, asserting authority with clipped words and cold restraint. Punishment followed. Eliza heard the screams from the house. She did not flinch outwardly. She had learned not to, but something inside her hardened. Later that night, Nathaniel found her alone in the sewing room, her hands moving mechanically. "You should not have to hear that," he said quietly. Eliza looked up before she could stop herself. "And yet I do," she replied. The words hung between them. Truth, once spoken, is difficult to contain. Nathaniel felt shame rise. Real shame, sharp and unwelcome. For a fleeting moment, he saw himself as history might see him one day. Then the moment passed. "I will handle it," he said. Eliza knew what that meant. Handling did not mean ending, it meant managing. The silence between them grew heavier, layered with unspoken truths. Each avoided naming what both understood. Naming would force action. Silence allowed continuation. At night, Eliza lay awake, listening to the sounds of the plantation, the distant movement, the restless wind, the low murmurs that carried fear from cabin to cabin. She wondered how long before attention turned into demand. Because it always did. She had seen it happen to others. She knew the cost. Nathaniel crossed another invisible line when he arranged for Eliza to be reassigned permanently to the house, removing her from communal spaces and isolating her further. He framed it as protection. He believed it. Protection, he told himself, was kindness. but kindness that restricts choice is still control. Eliza accepted the reassignment without protest. Protest had never saved anyone. But something inside her withdrew. She spoke less, smiled, never. Her silence became armor. Nathaniel noticed and mistook it for compliance. By late summer, Magnolia Ridge felt tense in ways no ledger could record. Overseers grew suspicious. Servants whispered. The balance Nathaniel believed he controlled began to tilt dangerously. Power, once exercised quietly, demands escalation to sustain itself. Nathaniel felt that pull even as he resisted it. He told himself he could stop. He told himself he would stop. But restraint requires equality, and equality did not exist at Magnolia Ridge. One night, as cicadas screamed in the dark and the air pressed heavy against skin, Nathaniel stood alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet. He thought of Eliza. He thought of the law. He thought of sin. And for the first time, he understood that silence had not protected either of them. It had only delayed the moment when choice would be taken away entirely. Because in a world where one person is owned, escalation is inevitable, and consequences never arrive alone. Rumors never needed proof at Magnolia Ridge. They only needed fear. Fear gave them shape. Fear gave them direction. And once spoken, even in whispers, rumors became a force stronger than truth. Eliza felt them before she heard them. The plantation had developed a new tension, one that moved like a current beneath daily routines. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Eyes followed her longer than before. Even the air seemed to hold its breath around her. She knew what it meant. Attention from the master always left residue. Nathaniel sensed it too, though he tried to ignore the signs. He told himself people talked about everything, that plantations bred gossip the way fields bred cotton. He insisted that his authority would silence speculation if it became necessary. But authority does not erase suspicion. It sharpens it. The first rumor came from the overseers. They noticed Eliza's reassignment, her constant presence in the house, the absence of other servants during moments when Nathaniel requested her assistance. To men who measured order through control, deviation was dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fields glowed gold with exhaustion, an overseer approached Nathaniel with carefully chosen words. "People are noticing things, sir," he said. Nathaniel stiffened. Noticing what? The overseer hesitated, not out of respect, but calculation. "Patterns," he replied. Nathaniel dismissed him coldly, but the seed had already been planted. That night, he drank more than usual. Eliza heard the rumors from the wash-house. Women spoke quietly, their voices edged with warning rather than judgment. They did not blame her. They pitied her. Pity was heavier than blame. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her thoughts guarded. She understood that rumors rarely harmed the powerful. They sought softer targets like her. Every step she took felt measured now, as if the ground itself were watching. Nathaniel's response to the rumors was not restraint, it was control. He increased oversight, issued stricter rules, punished minor infractions with disproportionate severity. Order, he believed, would restore silence. But fear only fed the whispers. Eliza noticed the change immediately. Overseers grew harsher, servants more rigid. The atmosphere of Magnolia Ridge thickened, coiled tight with unspoken tension. She blamed herself. That was the cruelty of power. It made the powerless feel responsible for the sins of those who held authority. The breaking point came with a lie. A young enslaved man was accused of stealing food from the kitchen. The accusation was thin, but hunger rarely defended itself well. The punishment was swift. Public. Eliza was made to witness it. Nathaniel told himself this was coincidence, a lesson, a necessary display of order. But as the punishment unfolded, as pain echoed across the yard, Eliza felt something fracture inside her. She did not cry. She did not scream. She stared straight ahead, her expression carved from stone. Nathaniel watched her face more than he watched the punishment. He saw something leave her eyes, and he realized, too late, that control had replaced whatever restraint he once believed he possessed. That night, Eliza did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her cot, listening to the plantation breathe in the dark. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow carried threat. She understood now that silence was no longer protection. Silence had become complicity. Nathaniel, too, lay awake, but for different reasons. Guilt pressed against him, sharp and unwelcome. He told himself the punishment had not been his fault, that the system demanded discipline, that order required sacrifice, but the excuses rang hollow. For the first time, he could not escape the truth. He had become what he once despised. The next days unfolded with grim inevitability. Rumors grew bolder. Overseers whispered openly. Servants avoided Eliza altogether, as if proximity itself were contagious. Nathaniel responded by isolating her further. He ordered her to work directly under his supervision, limiting her contact with others. He framed it as protection, but everyone understood it as possession. Eliza said nothing. She had learned that words could be twisted into weapons. But inside her, fear sharpened into resolve. The collapse came quietly. One evening, Nathaniel summoned Eliza after dark. No pretense this time. The house was silent, the lamps low, the air thick with unspoken intent. Eliza stood rigid, every instinct screaming warning. Nathaniel spoke of stress, of pressure, of expectations placed upon him by society, by the land, by the law itself. He spoke as if confession absolved him. Eliza listened without responding. When he reached out, not to strike, not even to touch, but close enough that she could feel the heat of his hand, she stepped back. The movement was small. The consequence was enormous. For the first time, Nathaniel felt resistance. It shocked him. Anger flared, not violent but wounded. His authority, so absolute in every other aspect of his life, had been challenged in silence. And silence, once broken, cannot be restored. Nathaniel withdrew abruptly, dismissing her with clipped words. Eliza left the room shaking, knowing something irreversible had occurred. From that moment on, the balance of Magnolia Ridge shifted. Nathaniel's restraint fractured completely, punishments increased, oversight tightened, fear ruled openly, and the rumors, once whispers, became truth in the minds of those who needed justification for cruelty. Eliza realized then that survival would no longer come from anticipation alone. The system had marked her, and marked people were rarely allowed to endure. Nathaniel realized something too, but too late. That moral collapse does not arrive with a single act. It arrives when justification replaces conscience. When silence becomes violence. When power stops pretending it cares. And Magnolia Ridge, once a monument to order, had begun its slow descent into ruin. Violence does not always begin with blows. Sometimes it begins with certainty. At Magnolia Ridge, certainty had settled in like a sickness, quiet, pervasive, and unquestioned. The certainty that the system was right, that authority was absolute, that suffering was unfortunate but necessary, and that Eliza had become a problem. After the night she stepped back, after the moment Nathaniel felt his control falter, something hardened inside him. Not hatred, not rage, fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear of seeing himself too clearly. Fear, when mixed with power, rarely turns inward. It seeks release. The plantation changed in ways that could no longer be ignored. Punishments were no longer reactive, they became preventative. Overseers were instructed to be vigilant, to crush disobedience before it formed. Small mistakes were treated as warnings of rebellion. The fields grew quieter, not from peace, but from dread. Eliza felt the weight of it pressing down on her with every step. She knew the escalation was connected to her, even if no one spoke her name aloud. Guilt clung to her like a second skin, though she had done nothing but exist. That was the cruelty of the system. It turned victims into scapegoats. Nathaniel watched Magnolia Ridge descend into harsher order and told himself it was temporary. That once stability returned, restraint would follow. But stability built on terror does not settle. It sharpens. At night, Nathaniel drank heavily, the silence of his study closing in around him. Memories of his father, Memories he had buried resurfaced with disturbing clarity. He remembered the certainty with which his father had ruled, the ease with which he had justified cruelty. "I am not him," Nathaniel whispered to himself. Yet the plantation told a different story. Eliza's world narrowed further. She was no longer permitted to leave the house without permission. Her duties were monitored closely. Every movement felt scrutinized, as if her body itself were under review. Other servants avoided her entirely now. Isolation was complete. She understood what it meant. Isolation preceded removal. Removal preceded disappearance. At night she prayed, not for rescue, but for endurance. The breaking point arrived on a day that should have been ordinary. The sun rose heavy and hot, the air already thick with exhaustion. Work began early to avoid the worst heat, but mistakes came quickly. A woman in the fields collapsed, not from defiance, from hunger. An overseer reacted with reflexive cruelty, dragging her upright. Shouting accusations meant more to assert dominance than to address reality. The punishment was ordered publicly. Nathaniel was present. So was Eliza. Nathaniel stood rigid as the punishment began. He told himself intervening would undermine authority. That leniency would encourage chaos. But as the woman's cries echoed across the yard, something inside Nathaniel fractured irreparably. He saw Eliza's face. Not fear, not shock, resignation. That expression destroyed him, because resignation meant expectation. It meant she had known this would happen. Nathaniel stopped the punishment abruptly. His voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. The overseer froze. So did everyone else. Silence followed, thick, stunned, dangerous. Nathaniel dismissed the crowd and ordered the woman taken away. The act was not mercy. It was guilt. And guilt, unprocessed, demands penance. That night, Nathaniel summoned Eliza again. The house felt cavernous, shadows stretching long across walls. Lamps flickered, casting uneven light that made the space feel unstable. Eliza entered slowly, her body tense, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel spoke first. "I stopped it," he said. Eliza said nothing. "I didn't have to," he continued, his voice tight. "You saw that." Still, she remained silent. Her silence enraged him, because silence did not absolve him, it judged. He paced the room, speaking faster now, his words tumbling over one another, about responsibility, about pressure, about how difficult it was to manage a plantation of this size without appearing weak. Eliza listened. When he finished, she spoke quietly. "They shouldn't suffer, so you can feel strong." The words were not loud. They were devastating. Nathaniel felt something snap. Anger surged, not violent, but sharp and desperate. How dare she speak to him that way? How dare she forget her place? And yet, how dare he pretend she was wrong? The conflict tore at him, raw and exposed. He dismissed her abruptly, his voice shaking. Eliza left, knowing the truth at last. There was no path forward that did not end in harm. From that moment on, violence no longer hid behind procedure. Overseers acted with impunity, emboldened by inconsistency. Nathaniel's authority, once absolute, now appeared unstable, and instability breeds brutality. Magnolia Ridge grew darker. Fear became routine. Nathaniel's guilt deepened into self-loathing. He avoided Eliza entirely, convinced distance might undo what had been set in motion. It did not. The final breaking point came unexpectedly. A planned inspection by neighboring plantation owners brought scrutiny Nathaniel had not anticipated. Rumors followed them. Questions lingered. Subtle accusations were exchanged behind polite smiles. Nathaniel felt cornered. Power, when threatened, lashes out. That night, an enslaved man accused of spreading rumors was punished severely. Nathaniel did not stop it. He could not bring himself to watch. Eliza heard the screams from inside the house. Something inside her broke completely. She understood then that survival would require more than endurance. It would require separation. Nathaniel stood alone in his study, long after the screams faded. The weight of his choices pressed down on him with crushing clarity. He saw the plantation, not as order, but as a machine, grinding lives into silence. And he knew he had become its most faithful servant. That knowledge marked the end. Not of violence, but of illusion, because once illusion dies, only consequences remain. And Magnolia Ridge was racing toward them. War did not arrive at Magnolia Ridge all at once. It came first as rumor, then as argument, then as certainty. For years, the plantation had existed inside a carefully maintained illusion of permanence. Seasons changed. Crops rose and fell. Pain repeated itself with grim regularity. Men like Nathaniel Harrow told themselves the world was stable, that the foundations beneath their feet were solid. But history does not ask permission before it shifts. By the late 1850s, the conversations had changed. Newspapers spoke of division, churches split along moral lines, politicians raised their voices, promising preservation or destruction depending on which side one listened to. At Magnolia Ridge, enslaved people heard the whispers long before the masters spoke openly. Whispers of war, whispers of freedom, whispers that terrified and inspired in equal measure. Eliza felt the change immediately. The plantation moved differently now. Overseers were more alert, more aggressive. Discipline tightened as fear spread among those who benefited from the system. Rumors of escape attempts on neighboring plantations brought swift retaliation. Nathaniel followed the news obsessively, scanning papers late into the night, his brow furrowed with something close to dread. The world he had inherited was cracking, and cracks reveal what foundations are made of. When the war finally broke into open conflict, it did not feel heroic at Magnolia Ridge. It felt chaotic. Young white men rode off wearing borrowed courage and false certainty. Flags were raised, speeches were made. The language of honor and defense filled the air. But beneath it all lay fear. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of retribution. Nathaniel did not enlist. He told himself the plantation needed him, that his duty was to maintain order at home. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was afraid of dying, afraid of judgment, afraid of what the world might become without the laws that protected him. As the war dragged on, Magnolia Ridge began to fracture. Supplies grew scarce. Overseers grew harsher. Enslaved people were worked harder to compensate for losses elsewhere. Hunger became common. Illness spread easily. And hope, dangerous, fragile hope, began to circulate quietly among the enslaved population. Eliza heard it in murmurs carried on the night air. Union troops moving south, plantations abandoned, chains broken. Each whisper felt like both a promise and a threat. Nathaniel sensed the shift in loyalty around him. Eyes that once avoided his gaze now watched him carefully. Silence, once submissive, felt strategic. Control slipped through his fingers, and he responded the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip. Restrictions increased, movement was monitored, punishments became swift again. But fear no longer worked the way it once had, because fear loses power when people believe they have nothing left to lose. Eliza understood this before anyone else. She watched men and women she had known her entire life begin to disappear into the night. Some returned beaten. Some did not return at all. Each disappearance tightened something inside her. Freedom, she realized, was no longer an abstract dream. It was a narrowing window. The separation came suddenly. Union forces were reported moving closer. Panic spread through Magnolia Ridge like fire through dry brush. Nathaniel gathered his overseers, issuing orders meant to preserve what could still be controlled. Eliza was summoned. Nathaniel looked older now, thinner, his confidence eroded by fear and guilt. "You will be moved," he said, "for your safety." The words sounded hollow even to him. Eliza understood immediately. Movement meant sail. Sail meant disappearance. She said nothing. Words no longer mattered. That night, Magnolia Ridge burned, not entirely, but enough to signal the end of its illusion. A storage building was set aflame. No one claimed responsibility. Everyone knew what it meant. Nathaniel watched the fire from the porch, realization settling heavily in his chest. The world he had known was ending, and he would be remembered as part of what deserved to end. Eliza was taken before dawn. No ceremony, no explanation. She was placed on a wagon, bound away from Magnolia Ridge, away from everything she had ever known. As the wheels turned, she did not look back. Nathaniel stood watching from the distance, paralyzed by the knowledge that this was the consequence of every choice he had made. He told himself he was protecting her. He knew he was lying. The war reached Magnolia Ridge months later. Union troops arrived to find a plantation already hollowed out by fear and loss. Records were seized, property was claimed. Enslaved people were declared free by law that felt both sudden and impossibly overdue. Nathaniel signed papers with shaking hands. The law that had once protected him now stripped everything away: land, status, authority, and the illusion that he had ever been different. Eliza did not see Magnolia Ridge liberated. She learned of emancipation from strangers, in a place she did not choose, carrying scars both visible and unseen. Freedom arrived not as joy, but as disorientation. What does one do with a life that has never been allowed to belong to itself? Nathaniel lived to see the end of the war. He walked through empty rooms that once echoed with control, now silent with judgment. Every corner of the house reminded him of what had been lost, and what had never been his to begin with. He wondered where Eliza was. He wondered if she lived. He wondered if forgiveness existed. Some questions arrived too late. War ended slavery by law. It did not erase its consequences. Those were carried forward, in memory, in trauma, in silence, and both Eliza and Nathaniel would carry them into whatever future waited beyond the ashes of Magnolia Ridge. Freedom did not arrive like a sunrise. There was no sudden warmth, no instant clarity, no universal relief. For many, freedom arrived quietly, almost suspiciously, like a stranger knocking at the door after years of locked silence. For Eliza, freedom arrived without ceremony. She learned she was free from a man she did not know, reading words from a paper he barely understood himself. The declaration sounded official, distant, almost unreal. "You're not owned anymore," he said. The sentence felt unfinished, because no one explained what came next. Eliza stood in a place that was not Magnolia Ridge, surrounded by people who were free by law, but bound by uncertainty. Some cried, some laughed, some stared into the distance, unable to imagine a future not dictated by command. Eliza did none of those things. She felt hollow. Freedom, she realized, was not the opposite of slavery. It was its aftermath. She carried the plantation inside her, the discipline, the vigilance, the learned silence. She carried memories of control so deeply ingrained they surfaced even when no one was watching. For the first time in her life, she could choose where to walk. But she did not know where to go. Nathaniel Harrow watched the world he once ruled dissolve into history. Magnolia Ridge was no longer a plantation. The fields lay untended. The big house stood stripped of grandeur, its white columns weathered, its rooms echoing with absence. He lived alone now, a man reduced to memory and regret. The law that had once empowered him now named him what he had always been, a beneficiary of suffering. He told himself he had never been cruel. But history did not ask what he had intended. It only recorded what he had allowed. Nathaniel often walked through the empty rooms, haunted by the past. He remembered Eliza's silence more clearly than any spoken accusation, her restraint, her endurance, her humanity. He wondered if she had survived the war. He wondered if she hated him. He wondered if hatred was easier to live with than guilt. Some nights he imagined apologizing. But apologies offered too late are not redemption. They are confession. Eliza eventually found work, not dignified work, not easy work, but honest. She washed clothes, cleaned homes, slept in crowded rooms with others who carried stories they did not share. She learned to accept wages that barely sustained her and expectations that felt uncomfortably familiar. Freedom did not erase inequality. It revealed it. But even in struggle, Eliza felt something new taking root. Choice. Small, fragile, imperfect choice. She chose when to speak. She chose when to remain silent. She chose to walk away when a voice rose too sharply. These choices did not heal her, but they belonged to her. Years passed. the nation moved forward unevenly, carrying the weight of its contradictions. Laws changed. Attitudes lagged behind. Violence did not vanish, it transformed. Eliza aged into a woman shaped by endurance. She never married. Not because she did not desire companionship, but because she guarded her autonomy fiercely. Her body, once claimed by law, now belonged only to herself. That truth mattered more than loneliness. Nathaniel died quietly. There was no ceremony, no monument, no legacy beyond records and land deeds that no longer carried power. He died knowing he had lived on the wrong side of history. Some men are remembered for what they build, others for what they refuse to dismantle. Nathaniel was the latter. Eliza lived long enough to see children born free. She watched them run without permission, speak without fear, dream without immediate punishment. She did not tell them everything. Some stories were too heavy. But she told them enough to understand that freedom is fragile, enough to know that silence can be dangerous, enough to remember that systems are built by people and can be undone by them too. History often speaks of slavery in numbers, years, states, laws, but slavery was lived in moments, in glances avoided, in words withheld, in power exercised quietly. This story was one of those moments, not a romance, not a redemption, but a record. Of imbalance, of harm, of survival, because love born inside ownership is never free, and freedom born after ownership is never simple. But remembering truthfully, is a responsibility, and forgetting is the final violence. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel.